There is a moment most avoidants never talk about. A moment that usually happens in silence. Not during the relationship. Not during the arguments. Not even while you were chasing them, trying to understand why they kept pulling away. It happens later. Usually when the noise disappears. When the distance becomes real. When they wake up one morning and realize the person they kept trying to emotionally control is no longer emotionally available to them in the same way. And suddenly, everything they buried starts rising to the surface. The memories, the attachment, the emotional dependence they denied, the fear, the regret. Because avoidants are not emotionless. That is the biggest lie people believe. Avoidants feel deeply, sometimes deeper than the people loving them. But instead of moving toward emotions, they move away from them. That is why loving an avoidant can feel psychologically exhausting. One day they pull you close. The next day, they go cold. One moment, they look at you like you are everything. Then suddenly, they disappear emotionally and leave you questioning your entire reality. And what hurts the most is this. You could feel there was something real there. You could feel the emotional connection underneath their walls. But no matter how much love you gave, they kept resisting it. Not because you were not enough, but because emotional intimacy activates fear inside avoidance. And today, we are going to talk about the moment avoidants finally stop running from what they feel. The moment they finally accept the truth they spent weeks, months, sometimes years trying to suppress. Because when an avoidant finally accepts their feelings for you, their entire internal world changes. And most people never understand what is actually happening inside their mind. So if you have ever wondered why avoidants pull away right when things become meaningful, why they suddenly return after distance, or why they seem emotionally conflicted even when they care deeply, stay with me, because this is going to explain everything. Here is the part nobody explains correctly. Avoidants do not fear love itself. They fear what love requires. Dependence, vulnerability, consistency, emotional exposure. To securely attached people, emotional closeness feels safe. But to avoidants, closeness can feel psychologically dangerous. Because deep down, many avoidants learned early in life that emotional needs were unsafe. Maybe emotions were ignored. Maybe vulnerability was punished. Maybe they learned they had to suppress feelings to survive emotionally. So now, as adults, whenever love becomes real, their nervous system treats intimacy like a threat. That is why avoidants often seem calm externally, while internally they are overwhelmed. And the stronger their feelings become, the stronger their urge to escape becomes too. This is why avoidants often sabotage relationships that actually matter to them. Not because they do not care, but because they care too much. And the emotional intensity becomes difficult for them to regulate. That is the paradox. The deeper the attachment, the more fear gets activated. So instead of leaning closer, they deactivate. They become distant, cold, emotionally unavailable, detached. Suddenly they stop texting the same way. They become harder to read. Their energy changes. And you sit there wondering, what happened? But internally, they are fighting themselves. One part of them wants connection. The other part wants emotional safety through distance. And until they confront that internal conflict, they stay trapped in emotional inconsistency. This is where most people get confused. They think, if they really loved me, they would move closer. But avoidants often do the opposite. When feelings deepen, they pull away. Not because the connection is fake, but because the connection feels too real. And reality changes everything for avoidance. Flirting is easy. Casual attraction is easy. Surface-level connection is easy. But emotional permanence? Real intimacy? The possibility of needing someone emotionally? That terrifies them. Because needing someone means risking pain, risking disappointment, risking emotional exposure. So the moment they realize, this person actually matters to me, their nervous system often responds with emotional withdrawal. That is why avoidants sometimes disappear right after moments of closeness, after vacations, after emotional conversations, after intimacy, after bonding. You think the relationship is progressing. Meanwhile, internally, they are panicking. And most people make a devastating mistake here. They chase harder. They over-explain. They over-love. They over-give. Thinking more reassurance will finally make the avoidant feel safe enough. But emotional over-functioning usually creates the opposite effect. Because avoidants do not heal through pressure. The more emotionally overwhelmed they feel, the more they retreat. That is why you cannot love someone into emotional readiness. And you cannot force someone to confront feelings they are still trying to escape. Now let us talk about the moment this title is really about. The morning the avoidant finally accepts their feelings. Because this moment rarely looks dramatic externally. Usually, it is quiet. They wake up. And for the first time, the emotional suppression stops working. The distractions stop numbing them. The distance stops protecting them. The rationalizations stop convincing them. And suddenly, they feel your absence emotionally. Not just physically. Emotionally. That is the difference. Because avoidants are experts at suppressing feelings while they still have emotional access to you. As long as they know you are there, waiting, available, emotionally invested, they can continue avoiding deeper accountability. But once the emotional reality changes, once they feel they could actually lose you, their emotions become impossible to fully suppress. And this is when avoidants often begin confronting feelings they spent a long time denying. They replay conversations. They revisit memories. They think about your presence. They compare everyone else to you. And the emotional truth they kept avoiding becomes louder every single day. I actually love this person. That realization hits avoidants differently. Because now they are forced to confront two painful truths at once: how deeply they feel, and how much fear controlled their behavior. That realization creates enormous emotional conflict. Because avoidants spend so much time convincing themselves they are fine without emotional dependence. They pride themselves on emotional control, on independence, on needing less than everyone else around them. But the moment they realize your absence is affecting them deeply, their entire emotional identity starts cracking underneath the surface. And what makes this even more painful for them is the regret that follows. They begin remembering all the moments they emotionally shut down instead of communicating. All the times they created distance when they actually wanted closeness. All the moments they acted emotionally cold while secretly hoping you would still stay. That is why avoidants often become emotionally overwhelmed in silence. Not because the feelings suddenly appeared overnight, but because they can no longer outrun emotions that were already there the entire time. And for the first time, they are forced to sit alone with the truth they spent so long escaping. You mattered far more to them than they ever admitted. Now let us talk about the signs. Because when avoidants finally accept their feelings, their behavior often changes in subtle but noticeable ways. Not perfectly, not instantly, but differently. The first sign is emotional restlessness. They cannot fully detach anymore. Even if they try distracting themselves, your emotional presence keeps returning mentally. And this creates internal tension because avoidants prefer emotional control. But now the feelings are becoming stronger than the suppression. The second sign is increased observation. Avoidants often start watching from a distance, checking your social media, rereading old messages, quietly monitoring your energy. Not because they suddenly became secure, but because emotionally, they are becoming more attached than they want to admit. The third sign is inconsistent attempts to reconnect. This is important. Avoidants rarely become emotionally expressive overnight. Instead, they test emotional access slowly. A random message, a reaction to your story, a small excuse to reconnect, a conversation that feels emotionally softer than before. These are often early signs that emotional walls are lowering. The fourth sign is increased emotional awareness. They start realizing, I pushed away someone who genuinely mattered. And that realization can create guilt, regret, longing. Especially if you stopped chasing them, because distance forces reflection. The fifth sign is emotional contradiction. Avoidants often become confusing when they are accepting feelings. One moment they move closer, the next moment they become distant again. Why? Because they are still fighting the fear attached to intimacy. The feelings are real, but the fear is still real too. And this is why people get trapped waiting, because they confuse emotional movement with emotional readiness. Those are not the same thing. This part is important. A lot of people build entire emotional fantasies around avoidants finally realizing their feelings. And yes, sometimes avoidants do realize what they lost. But realization alone does not create healthy love. Because feelings are not the same thing as emotional availability. Someone can love you deeply and still lack the emotional tools required for a healthy relationship. That truth hurts, but it is real. And this is where many people lose themselves emotionally. They become addicted to potential conversations, potential commitment, potential change, potential consistency. Meanwhile, reality keeps hurting them. Because breadcrumbs are not love. Delayed commitment is not love. Emotional confusion is not love. And inconsistency is not emotional safety. You cannot build secure love on emotional uncertainty. This is why self-respect matters more than emotional fantasy. Because some people stay emotionally attached to avoidance for years, waiting for one breakthrough moment. One emotional confession, one vulnerable conversation, one sign. But love should not require endless emotional suffering just to feel chosen. One of the biggest mistakes people make with avoidance is trying to force emotional certainty through more effort. They think, if I explain myself better, if I stay patient longer, if I love them harder, then eventually the avoidant will feel safe enough to fully choose them. But here is the truth. You cannot heal someone through self-abandonment, and you cannot convince someone into emotional readiness. Secure love does not require you to constantly decode mixed signals. It does not require emotional guessing games. It does not require shrinking your standards just to keep someone from leaving. And yet, this is exactly what happens to so many people caught in the avoidant cycle. You slowly start abandoning yourself in small ways you barely even notice at first. You stop bringing up your emotional needs because you do not want to push them away. You pretend their distance does not hurt you. You accept crumbs of affection and call it progress. You celebrate basic communication because inconsistency has lowered your standards without you realizing it. And the most dangerous part is this. The more emotionally unavailable they become, the harder you try to earn clarity from them. You begin overthinking every text message, every delayed reply, every mood shift, every moment of emotional warmth followed by distance. Your mind becomes obsessed with figuring them out because uncertainty creates emotional addiction. But love is not supposed to feel like emotional survival mode. Real love does not leave you constantly anxious about where you stand. And when you keep chasing clarity from someone unwilling to communicate clearly, you slowly lose connection with your own emotional reality. Instead of asking, "Why are they pulling away?" ask yourself, "Why am I fighting this hard for someone who keeps making me question my value?" Because the right relationship will not require you to betray your own emotional needs just to maintain connection. The right person will not make consistency feel like a reward you have to earn.